Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ankit Balani, consultant radiologist from Vijay Diagnostic Center, Hyderabad. I welcome you all for today's clinical radiological webinar on imaging of neonatal seizures. Whenever it comes for neonatal imaging, many of the radiologists are not quite comfortable reporting the scans. I believe this could be attributed to a mixture of factors, including differences in the acquisition parameters, which, if not properly acquired, may result into errors in interpretation, the ongoing process of myelination, which makes the interpretation a bit difficult, differences in imaging findings of same pathology in a preterm and a term neonate, and sometimes the lack of the exact clinical examination findings or laboratory parameters, which may help us narrow down the differentials. As we'll see today, there are a large number of pathologies which may have similar clinical presentation of encephalopathy and seizures. For today's discussion, we have two eminent doctors. It is my pleasure to invite Dr. Srinivas Murki, who is a consultant neonatologist in Parathma Hospitals of Hyderabad. Sir has done his DM from the esteemed Postgraduate Institute, Chandigarh. He is a postgraduate trainee for DNB and fellowship trainees of neonatology. Sir has more than 100 publications on his name. It is an honor to have Sir with us. Welcome, Sir, for this webinar. We also have Dr. G.A. Prasad, who has done his MBBS from AFMC Pune, following which he did his DMRD from Topiwala National Medical College, Nair, Mumbai, DNB from Pushpagiri Institute of Medical Sciences, Kerala, following which he was a clinical assistant professor in Amrita Institute of Medical Sciences, Kochi. Sir has more than 11 years experience following his DNB. He is working with us as a consultant radiologist in Dilsuk Nagar branch. Welcome, sir. Before we move on to the presentation, sir, we would be we'll be happy if you could share the clinical experience of a child presenting with neonatal encephalopathy or seizures. As to how would you approach a child, when would you decide that the child would need imaging, and what would be the expectations from the imaging? Dr. Srinivas, sir.
So thank you, Dr. Ankit, and thank you, Dr. Prasad, and thank you, Vijay Diagnostics, for organizing this important session on neuroradiology or imaging in neonatal seizures. Yeah, neonatal seizures is one of the commonest problems which we face in the NICU. Many of these babies land up with seizures, and as rightly pointed out by Dr. Ankit, the semiology of seizures is very similar, although etiologies could be different. So it becomes very important for us to know the etiology and prognosticate. And one of the important tools that help us in making the diagnosis and also in prognosticating is doing an MRI scan. Now we all know that seizures present in 4 or 5 different patterns, that is semiology. We have most common subtle seizures. We have focal clonic, multifocal clonic, tonic, then myoclonic seizures. So these seizures, we label them clinically, but many of the times the etiology is only broadly classified into 5, 6 different categories. One of them is the birth related, asphyxia, birth traumas, then the strokes, arterial stroke, then metabolic disorders like hypoglycemia, hypocalcemia, hyponatremia, hypernatremia, polycythemia causing stroke, then the inborn errors of metabolism. Then we have the congenital malformation, different type of malformations presenting with seizures. Then we have the infection, bacterial, viral, fungal infections which can present with seizures. Then there are some miscellaneous causes, um, which we often diagnose when we have ruled out all the common things. Now, what is the role of neuroimaging? Yes, most of us do the bedside neurosonograph, and that will pick up only the major problems like an intracranial ventricular bleed or hemorrhage or a major malformation can be identified. But MRI has become part and parcel of treatment of neonatal seizures. We do not discharge our babies unless we get an MRI. MRI helps us in two things. One is it confirms the diagnosis or it leads to the etiology. The second is it helps in prognostication. I think the second part is much more important because only when we know the prognostication, we can do appropriate treatment for the child and we can continue how long to continue the anticonvulsants. What do we do about the further management of the baby? All depends upon, to a major extent, what we get on the imaging findings. So I'm sure Dr. G.A. Prasad will highlight the etiological diagnosis of MRI on neonatal seizure, and also help us in finding out the prognostication factors which we are going to get from the MRI. Over to you, Dr. Prasad.
Thank you
Sir.
so much,
Thank you very much, sir.
Dr. Prasad. The stage is yours now, please.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Ankit, for the introduction, and thank you very much, Dr. Srinivas, sir, for the clinical input. And we thank you again for presiding our session, sir. So I'll start with the topic. Neonatal period is the most vulnerable period of all periods of life for developing seizures, particularly in the first 1 to 2 days to the first week from birth, due to various causes, and it constitutes a neurological emergency demanding urgent diagnosis and management. The incidence is variable and it varies from about 0.5 to 0.8% in the term and to about 5 to 15% in preterm children. Various causes as per the onset of duration of seizures post-birth can be classified as. On the first day, most common causes are the hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy and perinatal injuries. Other uncommon causes can be major cerebral malformations and genetic or metabolic causes. Those seizures which present between first to third day, the common causes are intracranial hemorrhage, hypoglycemia, arterial ischemic strokes, infections, and metabolic disorders. Those which present between 4 to 7 day, the more common causes are infections, metabolic disorders, usually organic acidemias. Other causes, arterial ischemic strokes, CSVT, which is cerebral sinus venous thrombosis, developmental malformations, and benign neonatal seizures. Those which present between first to fourth weeks, the causes are late onset hypocalcemia, sepsis, inborn errors of metabolism, cerebral degenesis, and epileptic syndromes. So we'll see if some of the common etiological factors one by one. First one is the hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, as this is one of the most common causes of neonatal seizures. We'll spend a little more time on this, as this is one of the most variable presentation factor also, like common one as well as varied presentation clinically also. So coming to HIE, it is a subset of neonatal encephalopathy that results from hypoxic or ischemic event, often in the setting of perinatal asphyxia, which leads to hypoxemia and hypercapnia. So role of imaging, it is first to diagnose as well as to prognosticate. So through which we can get an idea about the extent of injury of the neuroparenchyma, so that we can have an estimation of outcome of the disease. So the common modalities available are cranial ultrasound, which is the initial investigation of choice. The advantages being it is bedside availability and very inexpensive, and it imparts no radiation exposure. It is highly sensitive for detecting intracranial hemorrhage, hydrocephalus, fluid collections, and cystic periventricular leukomalacia. Though there are limitations for it, the common ones being the low sensitivity for detecting cortical lesions and inter-observer variability, and also operator dependency. Whereas coming to other modalities like CT and MRI, which have a greater sensitivity for detecting cortical injury, and they have markedly lower inter-observer variability compared to the ultrasound. Though CT is less sensitive and specific than MRI to diagnose neonatal HIE. However, it is very good in initial screening modality in cases like intracranial hemorrhage without much need of sedation. So it is a faster modality for imaging. However, the major disadvantage of CT is being the radiation exposure. MRI is the most sensitive modality for picking up the findings in a suspected case of neonatal HIE. HIE can be classified as per the severity of the insult, which can be either severe hypoxic ischemic injury or mild to moderate hypoxic injury. Severe injury is a condition also known as total anoxia. A typical example would be a placental abruption or a uterine rupture. Whereas other mild to moderate kind of insult can happen, which is also known as partial prolonged hypoxia. The common causes being postnatal, like decreased heart rate in the neonate, resuscitation post-delivery, or prolonged difficult labor, and other postnatal complications in the neonate, like cardiopulmonary related and hyaline membrane disease. So the pattern of brain injury also depends on the severity of insult, the duration of hypoxia, as well as degree of brain maturation, rather degree of brain immaturation, as in preterm or term neonates. So mild to moderate hypoxic injury results in periventricular leukomalacia and general matrix bleed in preterm neonates, whereas in term neonates it leads to parasagittal watershed territory infarcts. Severe hypoxic ischemic injury involves deep gray matter in both term and preterm infants, with the perirolandic region involvement predominantly in the term neonates. Although these are usually discussed as different subsets, whereas a single child may have a combination of findings involving both the insults, both the variety of insults, like partial as well as total anoxic presentation can be seen in single child. So very briefly, we will go through the pathophysiology, what actually happens during the insult. So hypoxic ischemia leads to switch of normal oxidative phosphorylation in a cell to anaerobic glycolysis, which leads to accumulation of lactate within the cell, which leads to cell membrane disruption, causing presynaptic membrane depolarization, which causes release of glutamate, which is a neuroexcitatory neurotransmitter, which leads to activation of the NMDA-mediated calcium channel receptors, which leads to influx of calcium into the postsynaptic cells, which further leads to cytotoxic injury to the cell and free radical formation, which causes internal cell organs injuries, predominantly mitochondrial injury also. So overall, what happening is this depletion of the cellular energy. So once the cellular energy is gone, either cell, when if it is severely affected, the cell goes into the necrosis. Whereas if the cell is mildly affected, it goes into apoptosis, which is a programmed cell death. So how does this imply our imaging findings? So the areas of brain with the highest concentration of glutamate or other excitatory amino acid receptors, which are particularly located in the gray matter, are more susceptible to the injury. The areas of brain with greatest energy demands, like which are actively myelinating, becomes energy depleted most rapidly during the insult, and therefore they are injured early on. And because of the delayed cell death from apoptosis, some injuries may not be evident on the initial imaging findings, and they develop over a period of few days later than insult. So these factors also explain the related specific patterns of injury which can be observed in a patient with hypoxic ischemic insult. Coming to the modalities, cranial ultrasound is usually the first initial modality, and when performed in first week of life in term units, has a fairly low sensitivity, about 50%, for detecting abnormalities due to insult, but its severity increases when it is performed after 7 days. The common findings include there is increase in cerebral echogenicity, commonly seen as periventricular flaring or increased periventricular echogenicity, which is seen as hyperechoic echogenicity in the periventricular white matter. The other findings include there is effacement of CSF containing spaces, sulcal spaces, due to cerebral edema. Also, there can be increased echogenicity in the basal ganglia, thalami, and brainstem, which can be seen in the first week. But these are more readily apparent after 7 days of insult. The presence of thalamic echogenicity suggests a more severe injury. In the late stages of finding, we can see prominence of the ventricles and the CSF containing spaces due to atrophy of the brain parenchyma. CT findings, since CT is not usually being asked these days for assessment of a hypoxic injury, I'm not going to details of the CT findings, whereas we see the MRI findings directly. So before we discuss the abnormal MRI findings, we'll see how a normal term unit brain looks like, or a T1 and T2 weighted images. The image on the left is a T1 weighted image, and on the right one is a T2 weighted images. So we are seeing at the level of basal ganglia, where we can see the caudate nuclei, head of caudate nuclei, the putamen, the thalami on either side of the lateral ventricles. These are the frontal horns of the lateral ventricles. So this bright signal is the posterior limb of internal capsule, which is a normal signal in a term unit, which should be brighter than the adjacent structures, putamen as well as thalami. So after term gestation of 37 weeks, this is a normal finding. Similarly, this posterior limb of internal capsule will appear hyperintense on T2 weighted images, this linear structure. So this is a normal finding in a term delivered neonate. So coming to the abnormal findings of a severe HI, there are 4 classical signs which are described, also known as 1, 2, 3, 4 sign for assessment of a severe HI in a term unit. These signs to enumerate are increased signal intensity in the basal ganglia on T1 weighted images. Similarly, increased signal intensity in the thalamus on T1 weighted images. Then absence or decreased signal intensity of the posterior limb of internal capsule, which we saw earlier. It is known as absent posterior limb sign. And the fourth sign is the diffusion restriction in the central basal ganglia and thalamic region. These signs develop in close proximity to one to another in the imaging in MRI. So this is again a term neonate presenting with distinct hyperintensity in the putamen and thalami. Bilaterally, symmetric signal intensity increase. So this is signifying hypoxic ischemic insult. Similarly, the absent posterior limb sign. Here, the previously what we saw, hyperintense T1 posterior limb of internal capsule is absent, whereas distinct hyperintensity is seen in the putamen and ventrolateral nucleus of the thalami on either side. But caution again, this should be seen only in term units after 37 weeks of gestation, and this may take almost up to 48 hours to develop. That means for the sign to go away. That means the hyperintense signal in the posterior limb to go away may take up to 48 hours after the insult. Again, diffusion signal changes. In diffusion images, we can see the hyperintense signal, the diffusion in bilateral basal ganglia as well as thalami. Similarly, ADC maps showing low signal intensity, corresponding areas showing low signal intensity, suggesting cytotoxic edema in the injured areas of the brain. So, what are the findings finally? Restricted diffusion, as we saw, can be seen at the earliest to appear and can be seen in first 24 hours after birth. The degree of restricted diffusion also increases over the first few days of life, frequently achieving a maximum at approximately 5 days. In addition, new regions of diffusion restriction that are not seen on the first day may evolve in the first week of the life. So diffusion changes typically seen only for 10 to 12 days after the injury. In some instances, these diffusion changes may go to normal side as early as 4 days after the injury. So a normal diffusion imaging changes do not exclude hypoxia. However, their presence can indicate a hypoxia. So, although diffusion images seemingly improve and appear relatively normal by the end of first week, this finding does not imply that the tissue is improving. In fact, this is known as pseudo-normalization. That means the normality is there, but it is appearing pseudo-normal on the diffusion-weighted images. So, at this stage, T1 and T2 weighted images are most diagnostically useful at the end of first week of life after the birth, when abnormalities of the diffusion have pseudo-normalized. Coming to MR spectroscopy, it is again within the first 24 hours after birth in full-term unit, it's very sensitive to pick up the hypoxic ischemic brain injury. Elevated lactate is classically seen associated with decreased Na, increased choline and glutamate peaks, because these are the neurotransmitters which are released during the cell injury. MR spectroscopy is usually not recommended in preterm units, as they usually show a higher lactate and lower Na peaks normally. So depending on the term or preterm, there are different areas which can be affected. So injury to the thalami, basal ganglia, hippocampi, cerebellum and corticospinal tracts are seen, with the involvement of thalami, superior vermis and dorsal brainstem commonly seen in preterm units. Similarly, basal ganglia injury is frequently seen in the preterm unit. However, injury of the basal ganglia is less severe as compared to that of thalami, and this particularly holds true in those born before 32 weeks of gestation. So MRI within the first day after injury may be normal or show only subtle abnormalities, and diffusion-weighted abnormalities usually seen by end of 24 hours. And signal changes in the T2 weighted sequence can usually appear at the end of 2 days and reaching a maximum by say associated with edema, which reaches a maximum of about 3 to 4 days. And by the end of third day, T1 signal changes begin to appear. Coming to partial prolonged hypoxia, which is the other subset. Till now, we saw the complete anoxia imaging finding. Now we'll come to partial prolonged hypoxia. In this case, what happens is the shunting of the blood to vital brain structures, such as brainstem, thalami, basal ganglia, hippocampi, and cerebellum. And these are spared to the insult at the expense of less metabolically active structures, namely cerebral cortex and the white matter. So in term units, more prolonged insult results in the injury to the intravascular boundaries, which are the watershed territory zones between the cerebral arteries, which are relatively hyperperfused and result in this shunting. So even events of mild to moderate severity in preterm units, they typically manifest as germinal matrix intraventricular hemorrhages or periventricular white matter damage, which is commonly known as periventricular leukomalacia. So a cranial ultrasound is usually of limited use in detecting cortical and subcortical watershed infarcts, because they are closer to the skull vault, giving the artifacts in the ultrasound. So therefore, MR imaging becomes the modality of choice for investigation in partial hypoxic events. Again, this is a term unit where we can see axial T1 and T2 images with normal signal intensity at the basal ganglia level and normal posterior limb of frontal capsule. Whereas in diffusion weighted images, we can see watershed territory infarcts in the bilateral frontal lobes and the right parietal lobe. Similarly, low signal in the ADC map. These are occurring at the watershed territory between ACA and the MCA, anterior and middle cerebral arteries. Similarly, in posterior part between the middle and posterior cerebral arteries. So classical watershed territory infarcts. Intraventricular hemorrhages, which are commonly seen in preterm units for the during mild to moderate asphyxia, commonly associated with germinal matrix hemorrhages. Germinal matrix zone of cells lining the walls of the lateral ventricles in fetal life, and which give rise to the neurons and glial of the brain. So after 34 weeks, most of the germinal matrix have involuted. The last portions which usually remain are the ganglionic eminence, which are present at the caudothalamic groove deep to the ependyma. Ependyma. It is a groove between the head of caudate nucleus and the anterior thalamus, which is the common site for germinal matrix hemorrhages. So these germinal matrix capillaries are usually larger than the normal systemic capillaries and lined by only simple endothelium without much supporting structures like muscle or collagen support. So they are more vulnerable to bleed. So germinal matrix hemorrhages can be also graded as they are usually seen at the caudothalamic groove. Like here we can see echogenic foci of germinal matrix bleed at the caudothalamic groove, and they are graded as when they are just involving the caudothalamic groove, it is grade 1. When subependymal hemorrhage associated with intraventricular bleed without hydrocephalus, it is grade 2. When there is associated hydrocephalus, it is grade 3. And grade 4 is the associated periventricular hemorrhagic infarction. There is a coexisting venous infarction also. So again, this is MR imaging of a periventricular leukomalacia diffusion image, where there is insult to the periventricular white matter. This periventricular leukomalacia, also known as white matter injury of the prematurity. So this low cerebral white matter vascularity until the age of 32 weeks plays a role in the development of periventricular leukomalacia. And it is frequently observed adjacent to the trigones of both lateral ventricles and adjacent to the foramen of Monro. So a classical hypertension signal diffusion in a preterm neonate showing secondary to hypoxic ischemic insult of mild to moderate variety. Similarly, axial T2 weighted image in acute insult in a preterm unit showing diffuse hyperintensity in the white matter associated with swelling, suggesting periventricular white matter injury. Similar thing when a chronic sequelae occurs, when we see maybe couple of months or years later, the appearance will be like this, where there is diffuse atrophy and paucity of the posterior periventricular white matter associated with gliotic changes, and there is ex vacuo dilatation of the occipital horns of both lateral ventricles, which is also known as squaring of the ventricles due to the volume loss. So this is chronic sequelae which are expected in the case of periventricular leukomalacia. Coming to the next subset of clinical scenario, coming to other causes. For example, when we have a child, who gets a seizures on day 4 of life, and with history of feeding issues. So when presented for MRI, above ones are the diffusion weighted images, below ones are the ADC maps, and the last two ones are the T2 weighted images. These show symmetric diffusion restriction areas in the parieto-occipital lobes involving gray and white matter, as well as diffusion restriction in the splenium of corpus callosum, with associated loss of gray white matter differentiation in the T2 weighted images, as well as swelling in the white matter. This is classical presentation for imaging presentation for hypoglycemic encephalopathy, usually associated with intrauterine growth restriction, small first gestation age babies, infants of diabetic mothers, or large first gestation age infants, and late preterm infants also. Other sites which may be involved in a hypoglycemic encephalopathy are white matter elsewhere in the brain parenchyma and caudate nuclei, putamen, and hippocampi. In such cases, the difference between hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy becomes little different and becomes a common differential for it. And both can also occur simultaneously. HIE findings as well as hypoglycemic encephalopathy can also occur together. Other causes, perinatal arterial ischemic stroke. Compared to those who develop seizure due to HIE, these seizures related to arterial ischemic strokes tend to develop later and are more often focal. It is possible to recognize the larger MCA infarcts and lenticulostriate infarcts, which are well within the field of view of ultrasound, but it will take around 24 to 72 hours for the changes like increased echogenicity to become apparent. So it may not be possible to recognize cortical infarcts and infarcts in the territory of posterior cerebral arteries using cranial ultrasound unless the posterior fontanel window is used for ultrasound. So hence MRI, especially diffusion weighted images, enables to pick up the findings of an ischemic strokes. And MRI angiogram also very helpful to assess the major cerebral arteries. Cerebral sinus venous thrombosis. The presence of an intraventricular hemorrhage associated with unilateral thalamic hemorrhage in a full-term infant is highly suggestive of presence of cerebral sinus venous thrombosis. Doppler ultrasound may be helpful to diagnose occlusion of superior septal sinus at times, but it is less reliable for other cerebral sinuses like transverse and sigmoid sinuses. And MR plays an excellent role in the diagnosis of the thrombosis, which often require to confirm the sinus venous thrombosis. And making a correct diagnosis of utmost importance as anticoagulant therapies has to be used. Axial T2 weighted images on the left shows hugely distended superior septal sinus, and similar sagittal T1 weighted images show heterogeneous signal intensity in the T1 superior septal sinus associated with gross distension of the superior septal sinus. MR venogram image shows complete absence of filling of the superior septal sinus, showing thrombosis. Intracranial hemorrhages, the other subset which can lead to seizures. Hemorrhages like subdural hemorrhage, subarachnoid hemorrhage, intraparenchymal hemorrhage, and intraventricular hemorrhage all have been identified in full-term neonates. The prime risk factors being birth asphyxia and perinatal injuries. Usually, intracranial hemorrhages occur near the falx and tentorium cerebelli. which lead to which usually lead to posterior fossa hemorrhages in the dural space or within the parenchyma in the posterior fossa, though which is little rare. Newborns again rarely develop extradural hemorrhages since the middle meningeal artery, which is not yet encased within the bone, is able to move freely during the process of delivery and escapes the injury. Most subdural hemorrhages are secondary to trauma, and intraparenchymal hemorrhages is less frequently compared to SDH and SAH in a term newborn. Again, term newborn with the prolonged labor presented for MRI, where we can see cross soft tissue swelling suggesting caput formation. Also, intraparenchymal hemorrhages can be seen, which are bright on T1, and there are hypointense on T2 images with periregional edema. And again, we can see surrounding scalp soft tissue edema. Similarly, again, T1 SAG images, they show thin subarachnoid hemorrhage in the sulcal spaces in the temporo-occipital convexity. And again, this is a SWI image, susceptibility weighted imaging, showing nodular areas of blooming in the convex extraaxial convexities, suggesting subdural hemorrhages. This is again zoomed up coronal T2 weighted images, showing there is a thickening in the bilateral parietal bones on either side. We can compare it with the bone on the lower part. So these are subperiosteal hemorrhage, suggesting cephal hematoma formation during the prolonged labor process associated with overlying scalp soft tissue edema. This can be well depicted with an MRI. Again, T1 SAG images showing T1 hyperintensity in the posterior fossa, suggesting subdural hemorrhage. Also, axial T1 image showing T1 hyperintense areas, suggesting thin subdural hemorrhages in a term neonate. Coming to infections, there are few infections where we can try to pinpoint the causative organisms. Few of them which we can see now. This particular case presented around third week of gestation, third week of post-natal delivery, where we can see large areas of cavities in the white matter, predominantly limited to the white matter, and we can see large diffusion restriction areas within the cavities with complete loss of the white matter areas in the brain bilaterally. Associated gliotic areas also seen in the right frontal lobe. I'm sorry. Yeah. T1 weighted images again showing signal intensity, increased signal intensity in these cavities. This is classical for Enterobacter cerebral abscesses, commonly which is a gram-negative bacilli and coliform variety of bacteria. And other similar bacteria which can produce this kind of appearance are the Citrobacter group of infections and E. coli group of infections. Coming to next infections, viral encephalitis, where we can have cross diffusion restriction in the periventricular white matter, usually symmetric in appearance. And this particular case was in the fourth week of postnatal delivery. It was a case of the viral assay was positive for the chikungunya virus, where the baby had a vertical transmission from the mother, who was also positive for the viral virus. So chikungunya virus encephalitis. This pattern of encephalitis can also be seen in rotavirus infections and other paricoviruses and enterovirus group of infections. Also, similar presentation can be seen in the dengue virus infections, also dengue encephalitis. So other infections sometimes like gram-negative bacterial infection and late onset group B streptococcal infection can cause severe brain injury. Bacillus cereus septicemia can cause white matter injury with cystic changes within hours after onset of the infection. Herpes simplex virus may sometimes affect the temporal lobes, but can also affect the other areas of the neutral brain, as contrast to the adult presentation, where we only see the temporal lobe and basifrontal lobe infections. Other infection manifestations like meningitis, ventriculitis, hydrocephalus, vasculitic infarcts, and subdural collections can come up. But again, we cannot pinpoint the organism-specific cause in these imaging findings. Coming to inborn errors of metabolism, usually associated with seizures, few other clinical presentation can be there, like abnormal level of consciousness, tone and reflex abnormalities, apnea, aspiration, and feeding difficulties, with usually no history of any event like suggesting hypoxic ischemic insult. This presented with this child presented with a seizure onset from 6th day of birth. We can see classical symmetric diffusion restriction, marked symmetric diffusion restriction in the deep cerebellar white matter, brainstem, cerebral peduncles, posterior limb of frontal capsule, and bilateral thalami extending into the corticospinal tracts. So similarly, coronal T2 images showing gross T2 hyperintensity along the course of the corticospinal tracts on either side. This is classical for maple syrup urine disease, which is a disorder for catabolism disorder for branch chain amino acids, where the signal diffusion restriction image findings are due to classical intramyelinic edema, which usually happens in the myelinated white matter, which are affected. And the spectroscopy, if we do, we can see a lactic peak due to anaerobic glycolysis. And also we can see 0.9 ppm resonance peak due to the branch chain amino acids, which are present in the affected areas. This particular case I have taken from the journal for illustration, where we can see bilateral symmetric hyperintense signal in diffusion in the postal limb of ventral capsule, and which is extending into the dorsal midbrain and the pons. And we can see glycine peak at 3.5 ppm. So this is again classical for hyperglycemic, non-ketotic hyperglycemic encephalopathy. Non-ketotic hyperglycemia, which is again usually one of the causes which can present the first day of birth with seizures. And we can see a diffusion restriction in the post limb of ventral capsule on either side, which is usually due to the vacuolating myelonopathy. And associated findings which can be present are dysplastic corpus callosum and bullhorn shape of the frontal horns of the ventricles. Other differential, one of other cause, other important finding which have a case which I have taken from the journal, which is common differential for hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, which is a molybdenum cofactor deficiency or sulfite oxidase deficiency. Though it is uncommon, but one should be aware because this is a common differential when the findings are similar to hypoxic ischemic insult, but there is no history of the insult. So here we see a diffuse this CT image where we see diffuse hypodensity in the cerebral, and similar low signal ADC values will be seen in the white matter, and the white and T2-weighted MR images we can see diffuse hyperintense signal on MRI in the white matter associated with swelling of the white matter. So typical onset of seizure occurs in the first day of life. So this is one of the common differential which we should be aware of as a radiologist. Then coming to other subtopics, sub causes which can cause cerebral dysgenesis or genetic disorders. In many of these infants, there are associated findings leading to diagnosis, like migrational disorders may be encountered in children with metabolic disorder, like polymicrogyria in Zellweger syndrome, which is a paroxysmal disorder, or even congenital CMV infections, cytomegalovirus infections. Neurocutaneous syndromes may also present with neonatal seizures. Axial T2-weighted image at the level of Sylvan fissures, we can see small size polymicrogyria, small convoluted gyrations in the brain parenchyma, and altered contour of the Sylvan fissure also. So classical perisylvian polymicrogyria appearance. Again, this I have taken for illustration from a journal showing all the manifestations in a case of congenital CMV. When imaged, CT findings can show periventricular calcifications and lysencephaly appearance, which is the figure of 8 appearance with loss of normal sulcations of the brain parenchyma and poor gray white matter differentiation. This particular case manifestation is the patchy gyria, where we can see loss of normal undulations in the gyri, smooth broad gyri, which is patchy gyria, and polymicrogyria in the right frontal region. As compared to the left, we can see small gyrations in the right frontal lobe. Associated periventricular signal white matter changes and temporal lobe cyst can also be seen. Flare images showing signal intensity similar to CSF, and T2-weighted images showing similar to CSF. Similar lenticular striate vasculopathy can also be associated in congenital CMV infections. Early infantile epileptic encephalopathy, also known as Ohtahara syndrome, is a diagnosis usually made when intractable seizures are seen in the neonatal period. So many of these infants can have associated underlying cerebral malformations. This particular case, where we complete corpus callosal dysgenesis, there is complete absence of the corpus callosum, when we can see small lipoma at the site of corpus callosum. Associated widely placed and dilated lateral ventricles can be seen, and these dilated ventricles with dilatation of occipital horns suggesting colpocephaly. And coronal T2-weighted image again showing widely placed frontal horns secondary to dilatation of the ventricles, which is also known as moose head sign. Other anomaly which we saw, this was again presented in the third week of postnatal with a dysmorphic appearance of the pons, where grossly smaller size the pons and the cerebellum with a dilated fourth ventricle also, and there were white matter signal changes and associated hydrocephalus. This is this was a case of pontocerebellar hypoplasia. Again, we can say this child presented in fourth week of postnatally, presented with seizures where we can see there's complete fusion of the thalamus with the midbrain and complete loss of the intervening CSF space, which generally is present. Associated, we can see dilated both lateral ventricles and diffuse thinning of the brain parenchyma. And in axial T288 images, again, we can see effacement of the interpedunclar system, secondary to fusion of the midbrain with the thalami. And there is a thin cleft within the midbrain as well. This was a case of diencephalic mesencephalic junction dysplasia. So the key points, key message, and which we should consider: cranial ultrasound should be performed for all newborns presenting with seizures in the acute phase, and it is strongly recommended to perform an MRI in a suspected case of hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy for diagnosis and prognostic evaluation. In any case of suspected cerebral synovenous thrombosis, MR immunography should be added to the protocol. And in cases of suspected inborn errors of metabolism, MR spectroscopy should be added to the protocol as well. And CT should only be restricted to the cases where intracranial hemorrhage is suspected and when urgent neurosurgical intervention is required. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Prasad, for this comprehensive review of varying etiologies presenting with neonatal seizures. Srinivas sir, if you would want to make some comments or would want to add on to it. Sir, we are not able to hear you. Srinivas sir. No.
It's
Yes, sir,
showing.
now. Yeah, now, sir.
So thank you, Dr. Prasad, for going through the entire series of causes of neonatal seizures, and also rightly, appropriately taught, highlighting the prognostic features. Yes, you have highlighted almost all the important causes of neonatal seizures, and also some rare causes which can be identified from the MRI. You also told us about when we have to ask for specific sequences like angiogram or a spectroscopy. When do we ask for this? Whenever a clinician sees an infarct or a suspecting a sagittal vein thrombosis, then we will ask for MRI angiogram, and also MRS we will ask whenever the EM in some of them, like you have already shown that anemia can be picked up. Hyperglycemia, NKH, non-ketotic hyperglycemia, can be picked up from your MRS. So I think you have in this, I think 25-30 minutes, you have almost covered the entire
Thanks.
Injury. Thank you.
Before we close the session, there are a few questions. We'll just briefly touch upon them. The first question that has come is, should we be Tesla specific while we are imaging neonate with seizures? Dr. J. Prasad, sir.
Yeah. When we are doing a scan with indication being a hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy or intercerebral hemorrhage, either 1.5 Tesla or 3 Tesla, they do not make any difference. 1.5 Tesla is equally capable of showing all the findings in a case. But when we are looking at cerebral malformations, cortical malformations, 3 Tesla definitely has the upper hand, where we have a better signal to noise ratio and better corticomedullary gray white matter differentiation also.
Yes. So unless we are looking at congenital malformations of cortical development, both 1.5 and 3 Tesla would be appropriate for imaging.
Yeah.
Then there's a common myth that all the pediatric scan needs to be done under sedation. So what is your experience on imaging of pediatric population, especially the neonatal population?
Yeah, unless the child is excessively crying or it is excessively irritable, so we can try a feed and wrap method, which is generally advocated, where we feed the child immediately before the scan, and once we feed the child, we wrap the baby tightly with a cloth, and then baby sleeps off. And once the baby sleeps off, we scan our protocol. It may take between 15 to 20 minutes, and the diffusion weighted sequence, which usually produces a lot of noise, we keep it at the last, so that initial scan is done and only we are left with the diffusion weighted image, which diffusion is again very short sequence, maybe less than a few 30 seconds or 1 minute. So we are till the time we are through with all rest of the scan. So this method can be used.
Yes, so we can avoid sedation, especially in a neonatal population, and provide meaningful images as well. One more common question that comes to the mind is, how is imaging of a child presenting with neonatal seizure different from an adult for which we are doing an epilepsy protocol? Because whenever it comes to imaging of seizures, the first thing that comes to the mind is we are imaging an epilepsy protocol. So how are these two scans different?
Yeah, when an adult or a older patient presents for epilepsy protocol, we are generally expecting lesions in the temporal lobe region or usually hippocampal region, to be more specific, which is the indication for mesial temporal sclerosis, and where we use dedicated high resolution sequences for dedicated imaging of the hippocampi. Also, we use some dedicated flare sequences, which is 3D flare images, which usually take little more scan time, whereas this is not required in a case of neonatal seizure indication. So the timing is usually lesser in a neonatal indication, whereas the scan time in a case of adult epilepsy protocol will be larger comparatively.
I think that sums up all the questions that were asked. We are already running a bit late. So, with the permission of Dr. Srinivas, we'll close this session.
Yeah, thank you everyone.
Thank you, sir. Thank you,
you
much, sir.
for
Thank you,
his
sir.
valuable
Thank
time.
you, Dr.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Thank you.